alongside the still underage Britannicus. In theory, they were meant to rule together when the time came, but in practice, the timing of Claudius's declaration opened a window of a few years where Nero was now a man and able to assume the duties of state, while Britannicus was still legally a child. For all intents and purposes, Nero, right now, was the sole heir. Agrippina would not fail to miss the significance of this development. In 53 AD, Nero's position was strengthened even more by a marriage to his now stepsister Claudia Octavia. The public was starting to get behind the idea that this grandson of Germanicus was destined to be their next emperor. But just as everything seemed to be going Agrippina's way, Claudius began to regret having given so much to Nero at the expense of his own son. Whether Narcissus was behind the change of heart, or whether the emperor himself came to his own conclusions is unknown, but at some point in 54 AD, Claudius began to look at Britannicus more and more as his rightful heir. Agrippina sensed that the winds were beginning to blow against her, and recognized that she might be facing a pretty clear deadline. Britannicus would soon be coming of age, and once he was a legal adult, Claudius was making noise about no longer then needing his manipulative wife and her spoiled teenage son. With Britannicus slated to take the rights of manhood in just 6 months, Agrippina had no time to spare. She was too close to fulfilling her dreams to let it all just slip away. Now, I am sort of going with the story here that Agrippina did indeed poison Claudius in October of 54. But it should be noted that though the ancient sources all agree that she did it, there was never any firm evidence they could point to prove their case. The accusation is based on supposition and probability, coupled with the old wicked stepmother motif that runs through all of Roman culture. Basically, Agrippina had the means, motive, and opportunity, and her character points to her acting on all three. The most common version of the story is that Agrippina conspired with Claudius's taster to slip the emperor a few poisoned mushrooms, though his doctor was also fingered as a possible culprit. Whether it really was poison, which I happen to believe, or whether it was just nature taking its course, Claudius became violently ill and died on October 13, 54 AD. He was 64 years old and had ruled the empire for 13 fairly successful years. The life and career of Claudius has to be one of the more unique in all of history. Good men and bad men, ambitious men and unassuming men, wise men and dumb men have all taken their turns in power, but all wind up conforming to some kind of recognizable archetype. But I can't really think of anyone who quite resembles Claudius, the accidental emperor. The guy was a punchline for his whole life. I doubt there could have been lower expectations when it was announced that Uncle Claudius was now in charge. But not only did he clear the minimal bar that had been set for him, but he was far and away the best emperor since Augustus himself. Now I know that isn't saying very much, as between the purges of Tiberius and, well, the everything of Caligula, it doesn't take a whole lot to earn the title best emperor since Augustus. But when you think about the image most Romans had in their heads of Claudius, the slow-witted, stuttering dunce, you have to admit that it's impressive how out of nowhere he came to claim that. If you rank all the emperors, past, present, and future, which is a list of somewhere around 100 men depending on who's counting, I think Claudius pretty comfortably sits in the top 10. He's not a great emperor like Augustus or Constantine or Diocletian, and he probably sits behind the so-called 5 good emperors in terms of impact and talent, but yeah, Claudius is in the top 10. I'm going to miss him. Next week, we'll get into one of the bottom feeders, who is constantly duking it out with Caligula and Elagabalus and Commodus for the title of worst emperor ever. Though I think Nero was pretty clearly not as bad as Caligula, and his leisure pursuits were far less insane, he was still pretty awful. The problem with Nero is that he didn't seem to have much interest in actually being emperor. He wanted to play gladiator, and sing songs, and compete in games. To him, the best part of being emperor is that everyone lets you win at everything. In his defense, Nero was only 16 years old when he ascended to the throne, which explains a great deal of his immaturity. But still, at a certain point, you've got to look yourself in the mirror and want to be a better person. If not for yourself, then for the people who are counting on you to do a good job. Because if you don't have that moment, and you just stay the same immature kid your whole life, well, Eventually you wind up committing a panicked suicide after your enemies have launched a successful coup d'etat. This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. As you are no doubt aware, Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment with over 60,000 titles to choose from. When you're done with this episode, go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome. That again is audiblepodcast.com/Rome. By going to that address, you will qualify for a free book download when you sign up for a 14-day free trial membership. There is no obligation to continue the service, and you can cancel anytime and keep the free book download. You can also keep going with one of the monthly subscription options and get great deals on all future audiobook purchases. This week, I'm going to recommend picking up The Satires by Juvenal, because nothing is quite as fun as poking fun at moralizing hypocrites in dactylic hexameter. Just remember to go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome so they know who sent you. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome, Episode 64, Smite My Womb. Before we get into this week's episode, I just want to say thank you for all the condolences that were attached to last week's sad announcement of my grandfather's death. A confirmed history buff, I know he enjoyed listening to the History of Rome, even if Dad did have to burn it onto CDs for him because, you know, iTunes is what again? The first time I ever read any part of Gibbon's Decline and Fall was from Grandpa's 3-volume set that still sits on the bookshelf in their living room. I look at those books every time I go out to visit and remember fondly being 15 years old and just sitting there, absorbed in the story of Rome with the chaos of a family Christmas swirling around me. Eventually we'll get into that phase of the empire where I'll be drawing heavily from Gibbon, and we'll need to reread everything. And though I now have my own set, the words will still be the same ones I read in Grandpa's old paperbacks, and I won't be able to help but be transported back to that time and place and think of Grandpa and thank him for just being the kind of guy who would have a 3-volume set of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire sitting front and center in his living room when a bookless grandson needed something to read to pass the time. The other thing I want to say before we get going is that last time I had this whole joke set up where I finally get around to introducing Otho, the last of the 4 emperors from the Year of the 4 Emperors, and I was going to do it in this really forced way during my closing remarks because unlike the other 3, he was pretty much not around during the last years of Claudius's reign. It was going to be like, oh, and Otho was also alive. There, I covered them all. But, well, it was over 100 degrees in Portland for like 2 weeks straight, and I'm writing in this second-story apartment with no air conditioning, and yeah, I sort of lost track of what I was doing. So if it seemed really weird when you listened to the last episode that I would make a point of saying I'm going to introduce them all and then, you know, didn't, there's really no explanation for it other than I was hot and fumbled the ball. Oh well. So, okay, on with the show. One of the reasons so many people assume that Agrippina engineered the assassination of her husband/uncle Claudius was because of what happened in the immediate aftermath of his death. The speed with which Nero was confirmed as the new emperor, the speed with which Claudius's will was suppressed to lock Britannicus out of his inheritance, and the speed with which Agrippina was granted her own independent powers just screamed foul play. Plus, just before Claudius died, Agrippina had sent Narcissus out of town on business, removing the one man who could plausibly raise an effective opposition to Agrippina and her son should something unfortunate happen to the emperor and succession became an issue. Narcissus, as I've mentioned, supported Britannicus as the lesser of 2 evils when it came to succession. With Claudius dead and no Narcissus around to get in her way, Agrippina was able to literally lock up Britannicus and his sisters in the palace and keep them there, while she marched Nero out alone in front of the guard, where they were ordered by the Praetorian prefect Sextus Afranius Burrus to hail the teenager as the new leader of Rome. Some question the absence of Britannicus from these proceedings, but without any pushback from anyone with real authority, like, say, Narcissus, they simply shrugged their shoulders and went along with it. After a hastily called session of the Senate confirmed what the Praetorian Guard had already declared, 16-year-old Nero became the 5th emperor of Rome. As with Caligula, the people greeted the announcement with a great deal of optimism. Transition of power are always fraught with danger, but this one seemed to come and go easily, and with young Nero now in power and no doubt destined for a long and full life, entire generations might be able to live and die without ever having to worry about the horror of a civil war sparked by competing claimants to the throne. It could be 50 years or more before the issue would even come up again. That kind of stability is precious. Plus, Nero was the grandson of Germanicus, and, a true Julian, directly descended from Augustus, smiling on Rome when they raised the boy up to command the empire. But to those who would actually work behind the scenes to make sure Nero was elevated, it was not the will of the gods that the boy himself command the empire. More like it was the will of the gods that Nero be a conduit through which they would command the empire. Agrippina especially did not see her son's rise as anything other than a means to her own ends. And in securing her own ends, she went even further than Livia had when Tiberius finally came to power. Immediately after Claudius died, the Senate obliged her calls to raise the dead emperor to divine status within the growing imperial pantheon. To head the new cult of the divine Claudius, the Senate declared that they could think of no one better than his virtuous widow, Agrippina. Granted 2 attendants to accompany her in public, Agrippina now had an outward display of the power she had been acquiring behind the scenes, which now included a literal behind-the-scenes component, as the empress was allowed to now attend meetings of the Senate as long as she remained behind a curtain. In the months after Claudius died, Agrippina was at the height of her power, and Nero was indeed little more than a conduit for the will of his mother. But it was not just his mother who held sway over the boy. Though Narcissus was of course destined to turn up murdered just months after Nero came to power, his fellow freedman secretary Pallas still remained ensconced as the head of the imperial treasury, and did not so much consult the new emperor as report what he had already done. This would lead to trouble for Pallas down the road, as would his close connection to Agrippina, but for now he was even stronger politically than he had been under Claudius. The other 2 major players in the early years of Nero's reign were the Praetorian prefect Burrus and the tutor Claudius had brought in to educate his adopted son, Lucius Annius Seneca, who, beyond his political role as tutor and advisor to Nero, is a major figure in the Western philosophical canon, not so much for the originality of his ideas, but for the role he played in articulating and translating the Stoic philosophy into comprehensible language. His role in Western philosophy, then, is much like Cicero's, as a compiler and articulator of ideas that had already been established elsewhere. His influence is magnified by the fact that later Christian writers seemed to embrace him, and so his work continued to be copied and saved, rather than suppressed or destroyed, a fate which befell most of his contemporaries. But for this period, Seneca's role as advisor and teacher of Nero is what he was most well known for. It probably doesn't even need to be said that with all these various advisors coming at Nero from different angles, a mother, a captain of the guard, a philosopher, and a treasurer, that there would be conflict between them. Pretty soon, they broke into 2 broad camps, with Agrippina and her lover Pallas on one side, and Burrus and Seneca on the other. I think it would be too simplified to say that one side pushed Agrippina's personal interests, while the other side pushed for Nero to consider the good of the whole empire when making decisions, but that is sort of how things shook out. One telling scene played out when Nero was to greet the ambassadors arriving from Armenia. To the horror of Burrus and Seneca, Agrippina seated herself next to Nero.
A scandalous move in the patriarchal ancient world that would have reflected terribly on Rome. At the last minute, they hustled